I'm Elliott, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys today. I'm an author of 10 historical novels, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite topic, which is primary documents. You know, those things that you have to, like letters and plays and music and photographs in the time period, those things that you need for your research papers. Those are primary documents. Now, before you glaze over, I'm going to show you today why those things are so much fun and such rich treasure, especially for books. So I'm going to use my latest novel as an example, which is Hamilton and Peggy. It's about the youngest Schuyler sister, Peggy Skyler. And if you know the musical, she makes a very brief, exuberant, and Peggy appearance during the Schuyler sister song. My editor had suggested to me that I do something about Hamilton, and I was a magazine journalist for 20 years before becoming a fiction writer. And the one thing I know as a reporter is that when you're going to write a story, you want to find a different tact than everybody else is taking, what other authors haven't done anything with yet. And by my count, Peggy Skyler only receives 36 solo words in the musical. So I thought, well, let's find out about her. And oh my goodness, you guys, what a hidden treasure the real life Peggy Skyler was. She was also witness to some of the Revolution's most important events, like the Battle of Saratoga, her dad's spy ring, his conferences with our Oneida allies, all sorts of rather amazing things. The one legend that everybody knows about Peggy is that she dashes into the fray of an attempted kidnapping of her father, General Schuyler, to rescue her baby sister Katie, who has been left in the cradle downstairs where there are 20 loyalists and his guard all fighting all around her. So she rushes in and she saves her and rushes back up. But other than that, not a whole lot was really known about her before. So what I did was to do a lot of research around her because there's nothing left in her own hand, hardly at all. So I had to read the letters and the journals and the biographies of her family and people who knew her. This novel is actually a perfect example for you writers out there of how writing really is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, especially with historical and biographical fiction. So here's what I came to learn about Peggy from these letters and memoirs and that kind of thing. Her peers called her a wicked wit. She was a favorite at dinner tables and balls. She was lively. She was sprightly. Benjamin Franklin even called her Wild Peggy. And one of Hamilton's BFFs also criticized her as being a Swift's Vanessa, which is from a Jonathan Swift poem, which actually is 18th century code for a whip-smart woman who wants to talk about politics with men a little too much to be entirely likable. He writes Hamilton, "Tell Peggy so. I'm sure her good sense will soon place her in a proper station." I don't think so. Peggy was just as much the revolutionary as her sister Angelica, and very much the same kind of thinker. That's corroborated by two sources. As an old reporter, you always have to have at least two sources to report anything. There was a French woman, a French aristocrat, who was not particularly impressed with Americans, except with Peggy. For one thing, her French was absolutely flawless and fluent. And I forget, oh goodness, I'm going to forget the aristocrat's name, but anyway, she called Peggy that she was endowed with a superior mind and a rare accuracy of judgment in men and things. The other thing that was really wonderfully a good corroboration of that was a letter from Hamilton that he wrote to Eliza a few weeks after meeting Peggy at the Winter's Ball, which we'll talk about more in a minute, where he was dismissing a potential suitor of Peggy's, saying he will, quote, Hamilton will not, quote, consent to Captain Beebe being Peggy's favorite. He's not clever enough for her. He sings well, and that is all. So my best source about Peggy, in fact, were Hamilton's letters. 2 PSs that he writes directly to Peggy, and all these amazing love letters that he writes to Eliza, where he drops all this gossip about my little sister as he starts immediately calling Peggy. There seems to have been a true, genuine, big brother affectionate teasing between the two of them. There's so much been made of the relationship between Angelica and Hamilton and Angelica and Eliza, which is all true. But in truth, within days of meeting Eliza, Hamilton writes Peggy, saying he has already formed a, quote, more than common partiality for Peggy's person and mind because of a miniature portrait Eliza painted and carries with her, which, by the way, is a wonderful revealing detail about the relationship between Eliza and Peggy, right? Eliza cares enough about Peggy to have painted a little portrait of her and to carry it with her when she travels. So they were close. They're only 18 months apart. They're very close. Next in that letter, Hamilton playfully begs Peggy as a, quote, nymph of equal sway to Eliza to come distract the other aides de camp so he can monopolize Eliza to himself. It is such a wonderful letter. I'd like to, and this is a primary document, I'd like to share a little of it because it gives you such a taste of the delight of primary documents. And with these letters, it's a sense of like someone from that time sitting down right beside you and whispering into your ear all their longings, all their hopes, all their dreams. And with Hamilton, because his letters are so long and so remarkable, you get his flirtatiousness, you get his ridiculously florid writing, you get his bad boy shtick, you get also this incredible youth and vulnerability. There's one letter that he writes that says, I hate the war, I hate people, I hate everything kind of thing. He was really quite young. Anyway, this letter to Peggy starts this way. You will no doubt admit it as a full proof of my frankness and good opinion of you that I, with so little ceremony, introduce myself to your acquaintance and at the first step make you my confidant. Phlegmatists may say I take too great a license at first setting out, and witlings may sneer and wonder how a man would show so great facility in his confidences to a lady. But the ideas I have formed of your character places it in my estimation above insipid maxims. So let's analyze that for a second. Hamilton clearly knows Peggy is no fool. And Hamilton also clearly likes women of intellect, which the Skyler sisters decidedly were. Hamilton's letter goes on. I have some things of a very serious and heinous nature to lay to Eliza's charge. She has overset all my wise resolutions, and from a rational sort of being, and a professed contemner of Cupid, has in a trice metamorphosed me into the veriest inamorata you perhaps ever saw. Okay, so what does this letter tell you about Hamilton and his personality, right? I'm thinking, poor Hamilton, right? Eliza's making him fall in love with her. He doesn't want to. And when I first read it, I thought, you know, he's just kind of this amazing combination of Romeo and Mercutio both, for those of you who've read Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio, as you remember, bemoans love's foolishness, and Romeo has been in love already with Rosaline before Juliet comes to town. Well, same with Hamilton. He had been in hot pursuit of a girl named Cornelia, so much so that a fellow aide de camp had written a poem for Hammy, as they called him, about the hapless Cordelia being a mere rant, the effusion of love's distempered brain. Okay, that too is a primary document, you guys. See how much fun they are? There was, by the way, such this really kind of wonderful literary bro thing among George Washington aides de camp. They really loved one another. So Hamilton's letter to Peggy concludes with this. By dividing Eliza's empire, it will be weakened, and she will be much less dangerous to the other aides de camp when she has a rival equal in charms to dispute the prize with her. I solicit your aid. This is to Peggy, right? So he's basically saying in 18th century ease, come be my wingman. Which, upon receiving that letter, Peggy Skyler seems to have ridden 150 miles to Morristown, New Jersey, through territory that's patrolled by loyalist bands who would have just been thrilled to have captured a General Schuyler daughter. Also, it was the worst winter ever recorded in American history. There were 28 blizzards recorded from November 1st through April 1st. At that point, there were 6-foot-high snowdrifts that had not melted for weeks. The temperatures were so cold that the New York harbor had frozen 18 feet deep, it was hard enough that the 18 feet that they were pulling cannon over it without making a crack. So into that, this incredible, dangerous journey that would have taken 3 days and an open carriage in those kind of freezing temperatures, Peggy rides off. When she finally gets to Morristown, it was snowing again. The soldiers' diaries really bring home the horror of those snows. The roads were impassable. There wasn't even wildlife died in the colds, so they couldn't even hunt for themselves. And they didn't have anything to eat for days. If you're interested, there's a really wonderful diary that was written by Joseph Plum Martin, who was an ordinary soldier who managed to survive all the battles of the Revolutionary War and write about them very movingly. And he wrote about having to eat bark for days. Okay, the fact that Peggy has ridden off into this wild winter, what does that tell you about her? Okay, it tells you she's daring, she's independent, she's been bodacious. I also think that she went to check out this flirtatious aide-de-camp after getting this letter to make sure he wasn't dallying with her beloved middle sister's gentle heart, especially after what happened with her oldest sister Angelica's elopement 2 years before. Now Peggy arrives just in time for the famed, if you know the musical, the famed Winter's Ball, which did in fact happen on February 23rd, 1780. Roads were so shocking, according to George Washington's Weather Journal, the snowfall so heavy that only 16 women made it through the snows to dance that night with 65 officers. That's a 4 men to 1 woman ratio. I think they danced a lot and their feet probably hurt. Now, if you want to, that's all research, okay? See how much fun it is and all these wonderful details that you learn, and you learn about all these people. If you want to be able to read these letters, you can go to my website, lmelliott.com. If you want more information about Peggy, you can click here and you'll learn all about the Skyler sisters and some of General Skyler's spies and the French officer who fell in love with her. If you go over here, don't be afraid, for teachers and librarians, you can go to a lesson plan that I have, but if you see all these blue links, you can click on and read all of those letters that I've been referencing and telling you about that are so remarkable. And if you want, you can take those letters and pretend to write a letter to Hamilton as Peggy in her voice, because you'll learn so much about her in these letters. I would like to conclude with reading you a couple passages, which you can listen to or not, but I'll tell you about the first I'm going to do. One of the things you need to do in historical fiction, if it's going to be good and it's going to be interesting to you guys, I need to paint a really thick tapestry of details. So it's almost like I'm dropping you into a film if I do it right. That takes research. Which is the fun part, right? We figured out. One of the little tidbits that I learned in reading about balls and things was that George Washington evidently absolutely loved to dance, you guys, especially the minuet. He was much admired for his athleticism and his grace. So I decided that what I would do was read a little bit more about a minuet so that I could actually write it in a scene and write it with some authority and authenticity. Well, I had no idea that minuets were performed one couple at a time. Can you imagine? Here's an etching of it from the time, so the primary document, but can you see the couple in the middle here? And then everybody standing there and watching them and talking about what they're doing? Those of you who have a little social awkwardness, that dance lasted for 4 minutes, okay? And you would have had to have learned all these really intricate patterns. This is just a diagram of the time of all the little serpentines and twists and turns that you were supposed to know how to do. It included little pliés and mini jetés. Wouldn't you love to see George Washington doing that? But for me, as a writer, what that did was it gave me an idea for and those of you who want to write, you always try to show rather than tell, right? So it gave me this great anecdote to be able to show to you Alexander Hamilton's insecurities. He wouldn't have been, he was not educated until he came to the United States, so he didn't have a dancing master when he was young. He was socially insecure. It also could show you Eliza's musicality, her graciousness, her gentle kind of loyalty and support. So it gave me a moment to show that about their personalities. Gave me a moment to show them falling in love, and also to allow my protagonist, Peggy, to witness it and decide to support it. Now, I would tell you that this is my daughter's favorite passage that I've ever written, she says. So I'd like to read it, okay? The setting is that we're at the ball. Peggy's already seen George Washington dance a minuet. Oh, and here's the other thing. Besides you doing it all by yourself for 4 minutes, one couple at a time, is that you did it in descending order of your social hierarchy. So it would have started with George Washington and Lucy Knox that evening. And so by the time you got to Hamilton, there was some serious pressure on A. Ham here to be able to perform. So Peggy stepped back, so nothing but air stood between Hamilton and her sister. Yet Hamilton hesitated. Peggy suddenly realized there was a shadow of panic on his face. Did he know how to dance a minuet? There was no faking a minuet, no way to simply mimic a partner's movements. One had to know the steps, had to have internalized the rhythms, as they weren't always obvious with the music's phrasings. Peggy knew nothing about Hamilton's background. She's just met him, I'm sorry. Whether he would have had the advantage of a dancing master, she glanced at Eliza. Her sister's luminous, rich brown eyes were fixed on Hamilton's and radiated reassurance. Eliza nodded ever so slightly at him, smiled, and mouthed, "It's all right." Hamilton took a deep breath and took her hand. It was magic. Eliza swept out onto the floor with a poise that stunned Peggy. Such confidence, the likes of which she had never witnessed in her middle sister before. As Eliza turned, the pleated train of her a la Francaise dress sailed in pretty swells behind her, like a swan on still waters. At first Hamilton moved with stilted, stiff dignity, but with each lilting phrase of the flutes, each near pass with Eliza, each momentary brush with her beautifully billowing skirts, each fleeting touch of hands, he gained a buoyancy, a beauty of step that was breathtaking. Their movements gained harmony until together, Eliza and her suitor embodied the musical metaphor of courtship that the minuet was first designed to celebrate and display. It was all palpable, poetic urgency, as they slowly spiraled toward each other in gradually shrinking circles for that exquisite moment they touched, right hand to right hand. 2 delicious rotations with their hands held, and then the bittersweet agony of withdrawing, hands still outstretched and beckoning, a plea for returning, before they had to repeat those separating snake patterns of steps away from each other. Even then, never did their gaze break. Hamilton's an insecure hunger, Eliza's a shy acceptance. When they did their final honors to their spellbound audience, Peggy could see that Eliza and Hamilton breathed in, out in tandem. The strings of their souls now tuned to match each other's pitch, their heart's pulse now beats of the same melody. The poise Peggy had noted in Eliza, it wasn't mere confidence, she realized. It was the power of love, the largesse gained by coaxing out the best of another human being, the promise of being there during dangers and unknowns, the leap of faith needed to take a risk together. In that minuet, Peggy witnessed her sister give her enormous heart to Alexander Hamilton. And then the other one, if I may read to you, it's about the same amount of time, is a very different scene. It's as she comes into Morristown. It's the contrast with what the common soldiers would be doing the night that the officers are dancing at that ball. The setup here, just so you know, is that she's been riding these 3 days of a journey. She's looking to end up at her uncle's house, Dr. Johnny Cochran, who was a physician to George Washington and also to the Army. He was married to her Aunt Kitty. Now, I did read a collection of Johnny Cochran's letters, and I'm so glad I took the time to do it, because his whole personality, he was one of the easiest characters to write, because just for instance, he wrote a letter to a superior officer who wasn't giving him the medical supplies that he needed for these men, and he called the superior officer a nincompoopa. So I kind of fell in love with him to begin with. Okay, so they've been riding for a long time now. For hours, the only sound Peggy had heard was the sweep of her sleigh along the ice-crusted snow, the horses' struggling trot, and the wind. No birds, no squirrels leaping from branch to branch, scattering ahead of her, nothing. The world was frozen, suspended and cold in silence. She wrapped the beaver pelts around her face so that only her eyes peeped out from the fur. The sun was low in the sky now. If they didn't make Morristown within 2 hours, she and the 2 men escorting her, Private Hines of her father's guard, and Lisbon, the enslaved servant her father most trusted with his horses, his sleds, and the safety of his family, might freeze to death on the road in the killing night cold. What had she been thinking? Those 2 men are real, by the way. Peggy glanced back to gauge the shadows cast on the Watchung Mountains behind them and to the east. She knew they were nearing Morristown, finally. Washington had chosen the village specifically because the mountain range shielded it from British scouting parties and attack. But the sun was going down, so they'd be engulfed in darkness and plummeting temperatures. "We'll make it, miss," Private Hines shouted to reassure her through the scars wrapped around his head and face. A 40-year-old who had been assigned to the easier job of Skyler's guard after he'd suffered a ruptured hernia, Hines always hunched with considerable pain. But he seemed devoted to her father, having grown up in the city of Albany. Private Hines had volunteered for the journey, crossed sheepskins across his chest to withstand the winds, and now braced himself on the rails behind her seat, ready to shoot anyone who threatened her. Peggy nodded, grateful, and turned around. Her feet were prickling with cold, and she knew that soon she'd be shivering all over. Another mile dragged on with nothing but thick forests and snow. Then, what seemed a miracle, Peggy spotted a lone, thin figure standing atop a stump, backlit by the sunset. It seemed to have wings, opening and closing like an angel. A guardian, or one of death? Peggy held her breath. Was she so cold she was hallucinating? But within a few more yards of the sled sliding along, she realized the figure was a sentry. He was slapping his arms to keep warm, and the shawl of his linsey-woolsey hunting shirt was flapping up and down with the motion of his desperate self-flagellation. "Ho! Stop and identify yourself," the sentry shouted in a thin voice as 3 other fellows dashed out of a lean-to they'd fashioned of sticks and aimed muskets at them. "Peace, lads," Private Hines called. "We're friends." Peggy flinched at the sight of the soldiers' ragged appearance. Their breeches and wool stockings were torn and patched. Thin, worn blankets were tied as tight as possible around their bodies with twine. She could hardly see their gaunt faces through the towels they tied over their tri-corner hats and under their chins to cover their ears. One had wrapped whatever pitiable shoes he wore in scraps of cloth. Another, the boy couldn't have been more than 15 years old, stumbled in tall Hessian boots he'd obviously commandeered from a dead foe, which were far too big for his feet. But to Peggy, they were possibly the most beautiful creatures she'd ever seen. "This is Dr. Cochran's niece, come to visit him," Private Hines called out. "What's the password?" "No idea, son," Hines called back. The man on the stump asked, "What's the name of the good doctor's wife? Not a Christian name, what her family calls her." Peggy pulled the beaver pelts from her face. Giddy, Peggy said. The shivers now had her, and she was shaking all over. One of the sentry posts smacked the arm of the man still pointing his musket at her. "Now look what you've gone and done. You must have given her fright. The poor lady's a-shivering." The angel soldier jumped off his stump, landing thigh-deep in snow, and waded to the sleigh. Pointing down the hill and then to the right, he explained to Lisbon how to find the Cochran's house. He touched the brim of his hat to Peggy, saying, "Give my respects to your uncle, miss. He saved me from a rattlesnake bite." This is true. "My skin turned blood orange. One side was completely paralyzed. Thought I was long gone to Hades, but Dr. Cochran rubbed the bite with mercury ointment and made me drink a quart of olive oil. And here I be." He was standing close enough to the sled that in the eerie silence of that snow-muffled forest, Peggy could hear his stomach whine and roll over and over in a long, anguished growl. And in the fast-falling twilight, she caught the flash grimace of starvation pain on his face. "Oh, sir, please let me share the dinner I packed from home. I fear I've eaten most of it on the road here, but there's a little roasted chicken and some biscuits left and dried apples." Peggy nearly cried at the response on their faces. The boy swimming in those enormous boots gasped and staggered forward. The man who'd been last to lower his musket bit his lip, rubbed his eye, looked away, and wiped his nose with his sleeve, trying to mask his tears. Damning herself for gluttony, she pulled a basket from under her blankets. The head sentry's hands trembled as he reached for her offering. "Much obliged, miss," he choked out, and then carefully divvied up the food equally among them before handing her back the basket. As Lisbon clucked the horses and they slid away, Peggy heard them saying grace. Thanks for listening.